The wind carried dust like whispers across the wide, empty plains, and Jesse Carter felt every mile in his bones. For 4 days he'd been riding west, leaving behind the soot-stained anvil and endless debts of his Missouri blacksmith shop. When the letter came, sealed in cracked wax smelling faintly of tobacco and rain, he almost tossed it into the fire, certain it was another reminder of something owed. But this one wasn't a demand. It was a promise. His uncle Edwin, a man he hadn't seen in nearly 20 years, had died out in Wyoming territory. The old man's lawyer wrote in neat, practice script that Jesse was sole heir to Cedar Ridge Ranch, 2,000 acres of pasture land and whatever secrets came with it. Jesse hadn't known his uncle well, only that he was wild, charming, and a little dangerous. A man who'd left home young, seeking his fortune on the frontier and never looked back. Now here Jesse was, coat stained from rain and road dust, boots splitting at the seams, a single revolver heavy on his hip though. He'd never once fired it at a man. The closer he got to Cedar Ridge, the more uneasy he felt. Folks at the last trading post had exchanged glances when he mentioned the ranch. One old-timer spat tobacco juice into the dirt and muttered, "Ain't much peace up there. Place is cursed." Jesse tried to laugh it off, but the words clung to him like a burr under his collar. It was late afternoon when the trail crested a rise and he finally saw it. Cedar Ridge Ranch. The main house was larger than he expected. 2 stories of weathered timber, its paint long stripped by wind and sun. The barn sagged like a tired old man and several outbuildings leaned against one another, as though they needed company just to keep standing. A windmill creaked in slow circles, its shadow crawling over the earth. Beyond the fences stretched, open prairie wild and untamed, dotted with cottonwoods and the dry bones of what used to be streams. Jesse guided his horse down the slope, expecting silence. But as he rode closer, he saw them. 7 women stood on the porch, lined up like sentinels, their dresses faded by sun and time, their hair tied back or tucked beneath bonnets. Not one of them moved save for the smallest, a red-haired woman barely past 20, who clutched something in her hands. It wasn't until Jesse stopped a few yards away that he realized all 7 of them were holding the same thing. A photograph. His photograph. Jesse's throat went dry. He dismounted slowly, hand brushing the worn grip of his revolver, though he wasn't sure why. The women watched him without speaking, their expressions unreadable. Suspicion mixed with something heavier, something like grief. Finally, the tallest among them stepped forward, her skin bronzed from the sun, her black hair streaked with silver. Her voice was low and steady. "You're late," she said. "We've been waiting." Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and something burned long ago. The women gathered around the wide oak table while Jesse sat stiff-backed, wishing he understood what the hell was going on. The tall woman introduced herself as Marisol, a widow from Santa Fe. Beside her sat Clara, a quiet Norwegian with pale hair and eyes that seemed to see right through him. Then came the others, Ruby, the fiery redhead, Eliza, a solemn Irish woman whose rosary beads clicked softly in her hands, Agnes, thin and sharp-eyed, as a hawk, June, barely more than a girl, her innocence fragile as glass, and finally, Ada, a half-Lakota woman with a stare that made Jesse's skin prickle. Marisol slid a stack of papers across the table, marriage certificates. 7 of them. "Your uncle," she said, "married each of us, one after the other. Some of us overlap." Jesse blinked, confused. 7 marriages, but he promised us protection, Marisol cut in. He promised land, safety, a future. Then, last winter, he took sick and died. Except, she hesitated, glancing at Ada. Not everyone believes he died natural. Ada's gaze locked on Jesse, unblinking. "Someone killed him," she said softly, "and one of us knows who." That night, Jesse lay awake in a room that once belonged to his uncle, staring at the cracked ceiling while the prairie wind rattled the windows. Every creak of the old house set his nerves on edge. He tried to piece together what he'd learned, but the puzzle made no sense. 7 widows, 7 promises, 7 motives. Sometime past midnight, he heard soft footsteps outside his door. He sat up, hand on his revolver, but the sound faded down the hallway. Reluctantly, he lay back down until his hand brushed something beneath the mattress. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked, pages yellowed and curling. He opened it, scanning the cramped handwriting. Entries about debts, cattle drives, bitter feuds with neighboring ranchers, whispers of stolen land, and a single repeated line, scratched into the margins again and again like a man possessed. Don't trust them. Don't trust any of them. At the very end of the journal, one final note stopped his breath cold. If Jessie comes, warn him. One of them has my blood on her hands. He looked up, heart pounding, and that's when he saw it. Carved into the wall beside the dresser, the wood splintered and darkened with old stains. Leave now, or you'll die like me. Jessie didn't sleep. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, painting the land in pale gold, he stood on the porch staring at the 7 widows gathering silently in the yard. Somewhere out there, someone had killed his uncle. Somewhere out there, danger was waiting. And yet, for reasons he couldn't explain, he knew he wasn't leaving. Because one of those widows, maybe more than one, was hiding a truth that could change everything. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of brittle prairie air that cut through cloth and skin alike. Jessie Carter stood by the porch rail, watching mist lift off the grasslands as if the earth itself were exhaling secrets. The 7 widows went about their morning tasks with quiet precision, feeding chickens, drawing water, tending to a garden that looked more desperate than hopeful. They moved like women accustomed to hard work and harder disappointments, each one aware of the others yet never fully together. It struck Jessie that they weren't simply bound by widowhood. They were bound by rivalry, suspicion, and some unspoken agreement to hold their silence until the truth was forced out. Jessie saddled his horse, intent on riding into Dry Creek. He needed supplies, yes, but more than that, he needed answers. He wanted to know what kind of man his uncle had been here. Not the vague figure from childhood stories, but the rancher, the husband, the neighbor. The widows had given him fragments, but Jessie sensed their tales were more tangled than a mesquite thicket. If he was going to claim this ranch or even survive long enough to decide whether he wanted to, he needed to understand the land, the people, and the grudges that lived in its dust. Dry Creek was less a town than a stubborn gathering of buildings clinging to survival. A single muddy street ran between a saloon, a blacksmith shed, a general store with broken shutters, and a church that leaned eastward as if bowing in prayer. The sound of a hammer rang from somewhere, and a few children darted out of sight. As Jessie rode past, their eyes wide with the curiosity children reserve for strangers. When he tied his horse outside the general store, conversation inside fell silent. Jessie felt the weight of eyes before he even stepped through the door. The shop smelled of flour and kerosene, stacked shelves groaning under sacks and tins. Behind the counter stood a wiry man with a gray beard and sharp eyes. "Carter?" the man asked flatly. "You're Edwin's kin?" Jessie nodded. "I reckon I am." "Name's Jessie." The man spat into a bucket, his mouth twisting. "Didn't figure we'd see you ride in. Your uncle." "Well, folks got opinions. Some say he was a good man. Some say otherwise. Truth is, he kept water flowing when drought near killed us. But he also made promises he never kept. Left more enemies than friends." Another man leaning against the flour barrels laughed bitterly. "And left 7 women behind, each one claiming he was hers. Now you walk in like the Lord himself. Heir to land folks been fighting over for 20 years. Don't expect a warm welcome, Carter." By noon, the saloon was buzzing with talk. Jessie tried to ignore it, but the atmosphere in Dry Creek shifted with every step he took. Whispers trailed him like smoke. Some women peered out windows, crossing themselves. Men shook their heads muttering. He could feel suspicion tightening around him, not for anything he had done, but simply for being his uncle's blood. That's when he heard the sound of boots too heavy to be casual. He turned, and a figure filled the saloon doorway, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black coat that caught the light like raven feathers, his hat low over eyes that gleamed with cold amusement. Silas Boone. The name alone made the room stiffen. Jesse had never seen the man before, but he recognized power when it walked into a room. Boone was a cattle baron whose reputation stretched across half the territory. He'd built his empire on water rights, grazing land, and the corpses of men who'd stood in his way. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that had no warmth in it. "Carter," Boone drawled, his voice smooth as whiskey. "Word reached me you've come to claim Cedar Ridge. Mighty fine inheritance. But see, that land don't rightly belong to you. Not anymore. It belongs to progress, to men who know what to do with it. So I'll make you an offer." He slid a folded paper across the bar. "Sign it, and I'll pay you fair. You walk away clean, pockets lined, no trouble. Stay and, well, trouble tends to follow stubborn men." The saloon was silent, every man pretending not to listen yet, drinking in every word. Jesse stared at the paper, then at Boone. He felt the weight of his revolver at his side, though it was useless against men like Boone, men who commanded others to do their killing. "I'll think on it," Jesse said evenly, refusing to show the tremor in his voice. Boone tipped his hat, eyes gleaming with amusement. "Do that, but don't think too long. This land's thirsty, and thirsty men don't wait." When Jesse returned to the ranch that evening, the widows were waiting. Clara, the quiet Norwegian woman, was tending the fire. Ruby sat on the steps sharpening a knife, sparks flashing in her green eyes. Ada leaned against the porch post, arms crossed, unreadable as always. "Boone came to see me," Jesse told them. Marisol's face darkened. "Of course he did. He's been circling like a vulture since your uncle died. He wants the water, the grazing. Without Cedar Ridge, dry, creek is his. And what happens if I don't sell?" Jesse asked. Ada's voice cut sharp as a blade. "Then you'd best learn to fight, Carter. Boone don't lose." That night, as Jesse walked the ranch grounds, he found Clara sitting alone by the corral, moonlight catching in her pale hair. She looked fragile, yet there was steel in her posture, a quiet endurance born from more than just hardship. Jesse sat beside her, silence stretching long between them before she finally spoke. "You shouldn't stay," she whispered. "This place, it ruins men. Your uncle was not the first to bleed for it, and he won't be the last." Jesse studied her profile, the sadness etched into her face. "Then why stay yourself? Why not leave?" Clara turned to him then, her eyes full of secrets and shadows. "Because I have nowhere else to go, and because someone must see this through." Before Jesse could ask what she meant, a sudden shout split the night. He ran toward the barn, smoke stinging his nostrils. Flames licked up the sideboards, crackling hungry and fast. The widows came rushing with buckets, but the fire roared louder, threatening to consume the whole structure. By the time the flames were beaten back, the barn was half charred, the night air thick with smoke, and on the scorched wood of the main beam, carved deep by some unseen hand, were words that froze Jesse's blood. The smoke from the barn fire still clung to the air. The next morning, a ghostly reminder of how close they had come to losing everything, Jesse Carter stood at the edge of the scorched earth, boots sinking into damp ash, and tried to steady his breath. The barn's roof had collapsed inward during the blaze, leaving blackened ribs of timber jutting up like broken bones against the pale dawn sky. He didn't have the luxury of rebuilding right now, not when someone had carved a promise into the wood that they'd burn him next, not when Silas Boone was circling Cedar Ridge like a wolf that had scented blood, and not when he was living under the same roof as 7 widows, any one of whom might be hiding a hand that struck his uncle dead. Inside the house, tension had settled like a heavy fog. The women moved quietly through the halls, their skirts brushing softly over worn pine floors, their eyes sharper than knives. Every glance held suspicion. Every silence spoke louder than words. Ruby, fiery, quick-tempered Ruby, slammed the pantry door that morning hard enough to rattle the dishes, muttering under her breath about outsiders sticking their noses where they don't belong. Clara said little, as always, her quietness a weight that made Jesse wonder what she was keeping inside. Ada, the half-Lakota widow with the watchful stare, disappeared for hours at a time without explanation, returning with twigs caught in her, braids and secrets written across her face. He couldn't live like this and not without answers. By noon, Jesse saddled his horse and rode to Dry Creek again, hoping the town would give up what the widows would not. At the edge of town, the general, store owner Samuel Whitcomb, waved him down. The wiry man's sharp gaze darted up and down the street before he leaned in close. "Best be careful asking too many questions about your uncle," Samuel murmured. Man owed debts to half the territory, and not just money. Blood debts. Promises made to tribes, ranchers, outlaws, men broke most of them. Folks out here got long memories. "What kind of debts?" Jesse asked. Whitcomb hesitated, lowering his voice even further. "Cedar Ridge sits on land that once belonged to the Lakota. Your uncle cut deals he had no right to make. Some say he tricked Chief Red Hawk out of grazing rights. Others say he stole outright. Now Red Hawk's got every reason to see a Carter buried deep." Jesse frowned, glancing over his shoulder. "And yet my uncle married Ada, who's Lakota." Whitcomb's eyes darkened. "That's one story I ain't got the stomach to tell. Ask her yourself, if you've a mind to risk it." When Jesse returned to the ranch, Ada was waiting. She stood barefoot by the corral, her dark hair catching the wind, her stance steady as stone. "You've been to town?" she said, not bothering to ask. "I have," Jesse admitted, "and I heard about Red Hawk." Ada's expression hardened. "My brother," she said simply. The words hit Jesse like a hammer. "Your brother?" She nodded, gaze unwavering. "He wants the land returned to our people, always has. Edwin promised him fairness, but your uncle lied. Stole more than land, Carter. He stole trust. You think the Lakota will forget that? No. Red Hawk is patient, but patience don't last forever." Before Jesse could respond, Ada leaned closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "Your uncle was killed because of what he did. Don't fool yourself thinking it was the fever or the winter cold. Somebody made sure he didn't wake." "Do you know who?" Jesse pressed. Ada's silence was answer enough. That night, Jesse opened his uncle's journal again, this time reading more slowly, searching for meaning in every cramped line. Halfway through, he found something new. A folded letter tucked between the pages, sealed but never sent. It was addressed to someone named C.H., and the handwriting trembled like the hand of a man who'd been drinking hard. "They're closing. I promised them all more than I can give, and now they'll tear me apart when they learn the truth. Ada knows too much. Clara suspects. Ruby would kill me if she knew the rest. God help me, Jesse, if you ever read this, trust no one." The name Clara snagged at Jesse's thoughts, sharp as a burr under the skin. He closed the journal, unsettled. Clara, with her quiet grace and watchful eyes. Clara, who seemed almost too gentle to carry secrets, and yet his uncle's words lingered like smoke. She suspects. 3 days later, Jesse got his first visit from Red Hawk himself. The Lakota chief rode in at dusk with 6 warriors at his back, their horses kicking up red dust beneath a dying sun. He dismounted without a word and approached Jesse, standing at the fence line like a man stepping into enemy territory. "This land," Red Hawk said, voice deep and calm, "was ours before your uncle took it. We asked for peace. He offered promises instead, promises he broke. Now you wear his name, his land, his blood." Jesse met his gaze, steady though his palms were damp. "I didn't make those deals." Red Hawk's jaw tightened. "But you inherit them all the same. Blood remembers." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Cedar Ridge is cursed, Carter. Your uncle's greed poisoned this soil. It will swallow you too, if you stay." Before Jesse could reply, Red Hawk turned and rode off, his warriors silent as ghosts behind him. That evening, the widows gathered in the parlor, the air heavy with smoke from the fire Ruby had insisted on stoking too high. The women bickered, accusations flying in sharp whispers Jesse barely followed. Ruby accused Ada of betraying them to her people. Ada accused Marisol of hiding money meant for all of them. Eliza clutched her rosary and muttered about sin and punishment. And through it all, Clara sat silent, her gaze fixed on the flames, hands folded tightly in her lap. When the shouting reached its peak, the front door slammed open, and a stranger strode into the room. His hat was low, his duster travel-worn, a revolver gleaming at his side. "Carter," he said, voice like gravel. "Name's Silas Reed. Bounty hunter. Your uncle ain't as dead as they say. Man faked his death 2 winters back, and somebody's paying me real good to make sure neither of you live long enough to prove otherwise." For a moment, no one moved. The fire popped in the hearth, throwing sparks into the silence. Jesse's hand inched toward his revolver, but Reed's smile told him he wouldn't be fast enough. Outside, thunder rolled low across the horizon, and the first cold drops of rain struck the dusty earth. Cedar Ridge was about to drown, in blood, in secrets, in vengeance owed. And Jesse Carter had just stepped into the middle of a storm he couldn't yet see the edges of. The storm broke just before dawn, ripping across the plains like the sky itself had turned against the earth. Rain slashed sideways, carried by a wind that howled through the rafters of Cedar Ridge, rattling the shutters and groaning the old bones of the house. Jesse Carter lay awake in the dark, listening to the storm and the creak of the floorboards above, where one of the widows paced restlessly through the night. He had grown used to sleeplessness since arriving, but this was different. The bounty hunter's warning still echoed in his mind. Your uncle ain't as dead as they say. That single thread had unraveled everything he thought he knew. If Edwin Carter had faked his death, then who had carved warnings into the walls? Who had buried a body beneath the frozen Wyoming soil? And why had 7 women been left to mourn a man who might still be alive? And then there was Silas Boone. Jesse had hoped Boone's threat in Dry Creek had been just talk, an attempt to scare him into selling the ranch cheap. But 2 nights ago, he'd found hoofprints in the wet earth along the southern fence line. Boone's riders were circling Cedar Ridge, watching, waiting. Jesse sat up and pulled on his boots, the boards groaning under his weight. He glanced at the revolver resting on the nightstand. He'd grown up working steel at a forge, not firing bullets into men's flesh, but the world didn't care about his skill with a hammer anymore. Out here, strength was measured by what you were willing to kill for. By the time morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the land soaked and heavy with silence. That silence broke with the distant crack of gunfire. Ada was the first to reach the porch, her black braids dripping with rain. She scanned the horizon with sharp, hawk-like eyes, her hand resting on the worn hilt of the hunting knife at her belt. "Riders," she said flatly. From the rise, Jesse could see them too. Boone's men, maybe a dozen, scattered across the ridgeline like shadows against the pale sky. They didn't approach yet, not directly, but their presence was enough to send a chill crawling down his spine. Marisol crossed her arms tightly, jaw clenched. "He's making a show of it," she said. "Boone wants you scared, Carter." "If he thinks I'll sell, he's wrong," Jesse said. Ruby laughed bitterly from where she sat on the porch steps, sharpening her knife. "That's where you're a fool. Boone don't take no for an answer. Last man who told him no had his cattle poisoned, his well filled with sand, and his house set aflame. That's a warning if ever there was one." Eliza's rosary beads clicked softly in her hands as she whispered a prayer under her breath. Clara stood apart from the others, pale in the damp light, her gaze fixed on Boone's riders with an expression Jesse couldn't read. By midday, the standoff turned into something far worse. Samuel Whitcomb came riding hard from Dry Creek, his horse lathered in sweat, his face drawn and pale. He burst through the ranch gates and nearly fell from the saddle, gasping for breath. "They're coming," he wheezed. "Boone's got near 30 men, maybe more. He's hired guns from Cheyenne, Fort Laramie, God knows where. They aim to take Cedar Ridge by force before nightfall." The widows exchanged sharp looks, fear darting across their faces like lightning, but it was Ada who spoke first. "Then we fight," she said simply. The room erupted. Ruby slammed her knife. Into the table, Eliza protested loudly, and Marisol demanded they think of survival, not pride. Clara said nothing, only turned her head slightly toward Jesse as if waiting to hear his decision before she made her own. Jesse didn't want a war. He'd spent his life shaping plows and horseshoes, not burying men in shallow graves. But Boone wouldn't be bargained with, and there was no one left to call for help. The sheriff in Dry Creek was in Boone's pocket. Everyone knew it. If they didn't stand their ground now, Cedar Ridge would fall and the widows would be left with nothing. So Jesse made his choice. "We fight," he said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. The rest of the day blurred into frantic preparation. They fortified the house, hammering shutters, stacking furniture against the doors, and dragging crates of ammunition from the cellar Jesse hadn't even known existed. Ada strung a bow and laid out a quiver of arrows alongside her knife. Ruby cleaned her revolvers with calm precision, humming under her breath like a woman preparing for a dance instead of a gunfight. Marisol packed bottles of kerosene near the windows, her expression grim and focused. Clara, as always, moved quietly among them, tending to tasks without being asked, fetching water, sewing torn sleeves, arranging supplies in neat, careful rows. Jesse caught her glancing at him once or twice, her expression unreadable, and something unspoken passed between them, a fragile tether in the chaos. When the sun dipped low, the first shots rang out. Boone's men came hard and fast, hooves pounding like thunder over the wet earth. Their shouts carried on the wind. Jesse ducked behind a wagon and fired his revolver for the first time in his life, the kick jarring his shoulder. A man toppled from his horse 50 yards out, hitting the mud hard, and Jesse's stomach twisted. This wasn't a warning anymore. This was war. Bullets tore splinters from the porch rails, windows shattered under rifle fire, smoke from gunpowder mixed with the sharp tang of wet earth and kerosene. Jesse shouted orders over the chaos, his voice hoarse, adrenaline burning, like fire in his veins. Ruby fought like a woman possessed, fearless and wild, while Ada loosed arrows with deadly precision from the upstairs window, each shot finding its mark. Eliza crouched behind a wall, clutching her rosary tight even as she reloaded Jesse's spare revolver with trembling hands. And then, just when it seemed they might drive Boone's men back, one of the widows turned on them. Marisol, who had stood at Jesse's side for every decision, suddenly vanished from the parlor during the fight. Minutes later, the front door burst open and Boone's riders swarmed inside from a side passage, bypassing their defenses entirely. Jesse barely had time to register the betrayal before he was thrown to the ground, pinned beneath a boot, and, staring up into Boone's cold, smiling face, "You had your chance, Carter," Boone said softly. "But some folks just don't know when they're beat." Behind him, Marisol stood in the shadows, her dark eyes glittering with something Jesse couldn't name. Anger, desperation, maybe both. "You promised me a share," she hissed. Boone smiled without looking at her. "And you'll get it, once this is done." Jesse realized then that Cedar Ridge wasn't just land. It was a prize people would bleed for, lie for, kill for. And somewhere in the middle of this storm, beneath the roar of gunfire and the weight of betrayal, he understood something else, something far more dangerous than Boone's hired: guns. It wasn't the enemy outside the walls that scared him most. It was the secrets inside them. Night bled into dawn, and Cedar Ridge lay in uneasy silence. The gunfire had stopped hours ago, but the echoes still clung to the air like smoke. Jesse Carter stood in the ruins of the parlor, his shirt torn and streaked with dirt, his breath ragged from exhaustion. Outside, the storm had finally broken, and pale sunlight crept across the soaked prairie, revealing the scars of the siege. Two of Boone's men lay dead near the fence line, their bodies covered with torn canvas. Another groaned softly in the mud, left where he'd fallen. Boone himself had pulled back before sunrise, his riders retreating into the hills, but Jesse knew it wasn't victory. Boone hadn't lost. He'd simply chosen patience over pride, and that was more dangerous than any bullet. Inside the house, the 7 widows were gathered in the dining room. The tension among them was thicker than the lingering smoke, sharpened by the sting of betrayal. Marisol stood near the window, her dark hair tangled, her face pale beneath streaks of soot. Her eyes were locked on Jesse, but she said nothing. Ruby broke the silence first, slamming her palm against the table so hard the plates rattled. "You sold us out," she spat. "You opened the door to Boone." Marisol's jaw clenched. "I did what I had to. If Boone had won, he promised me a stake. Better than starving while this fool plays at being a rancher." "And when he killed us all?" Ada asked quietly, her voice low and cutting as a blade. Marisol flinched, but she didn't answer. Jesse leaned against the doorframe, exhaustion pulling at him like lead, but his voice came steady. "We can't afford to turn on each other," he said. "Boone's coming back. Next time, he won't just test our defenses. Next time, he'll finish this," Ruby scoffed, fire still in her green eyes. "And what then? You think we'll all die for Cedar Ridge? Maybe some of us got nothing left to lose, but I ain't one of them." Eliza's rosary beads clicked softly as she whispered a prayer under her breath, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. June, the youngest widow, stood near the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, wide-eyed and silent. And Clara sat at the far end of the table, her pale hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze lowered. She hadn't spoken a word since the fighting stopped, but Jesse could feel the weight of her silence pressing against him like a confession she couldn't yet bring herself to make. Later, when the others drifted away to tend their wounds and broken defenses, Jesse found Clara outside, sitting on the porch steps with her skirts damp from the lingering rain. Her pale hair caught the weak morning light, a silvery halo against the shadows beneath her eyes. He hesitated before sitting beside her, the wood creaking under his weight. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Clara whispered, "You should leave Jesse and give Boone what he wants," he asked quietly. "Give yourself a chance to live," she said, her voice trembling despite the steadiness of her posture. "Cedar Ridge isn't worth dying for. Nothing here is." Jesse turned toward her, searching her expression. "Then why are you still here?" Clara's breath caught, and she stared down at her hands, twisting her fingers together as though trying to hold something inside. "Because I have nowhere else," she said finally, "and because leaving wouldn't change what's already been done." Her voice broke on the last words, and before Jesse could stop himself, he reached out, his hand covering hers. She didn't pull away. The kiss that followed was quiet, tentative, almost fearful. The meeting of two broken souls clinging to something neither of them could name. For a moment, the chaos outside faded, the looming shadow of Boone and blood debts and unspoken betrayals falling away. There was only the two of them, caught in the fragile promise of something more. But promises are fragile things on the frontier. When Jesse pulled back, Clara's eyes brimmed with secrets she wasn't ready to share. Before he could ask, Ada's voice cut through the stillness from the porch doorway. "You shouldn't trust her." Jesse turned sharply, but Ada didn't flinch. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the wet boards, her expression carved from stone. "Your uncle loved Clara," she said simply. "More than he loved any of us, and Clara loved him back." Jesse stared at Clara, his chest tightening. She didn't deny it. She only lowered her gaze, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. That night, Jesse couldn't sleep. Every creak of the old house felt like a confession he hadn't asked for. He tried to bury himself in work, repairing what they could have, the barn and reinforcing the fence line, but his thoughts kept circling the same impossible questions. Who killed Edwin Carter? And why? The answer came in the form of a scream. He bolted upright from his bed, revolver in hand, as footsteps thundered down the hallway. By the time he reached the parlor, June, the youngest widow, stood there trembling, her nightdress streaked with blood. "She's gone," June whispered, her voice breaking. "Marisol's gone." Ada appeared behind her, breathing hard. "There's tracks outside," she said grimly. "She's not missing. She ran." But Marisol hadn't run far. By sunrise, they found her at the creek, slumped against a fallen tree, a bullet hole dark and wet just above her heart. Her eyes were open, glassy with the shock of dying, and clutched in her hand was a folded scrap of paper, smudged with blood. Jesse pried it open carefully, his stomach sinking as he read the single line scrawled across it. He has a son. The words meant nothing at first. And then, like a hammer striking steel, the pieces began to fall into place. Edwin Carter hadn't just left behind 7 widows and a ranch soaked in debts and lies. He'd left behind a child, a rightful heir. And if Boone, the widows, or Red Hawk learned of that child, Cedar Ridge would become a battlefield unlike anything Jesse had faced yet. The night after Marisol's death stretched endlessly, heavy, with silence. A storm brewed somewhere beyond the hills, its distant thunder rolling across the plains like a warning. Inside Cedar Ridge, the widows huddled close around the kitchen table, their faces drawn and pale, each one haunted by the same thought they dared not voice. Marisol hadn't just run. She'd been hunted. Jesse Carter stood apart from them, leaning against the doorframe, the folded scrap of paper still clenched in his fist. The word scrawled on it burned hotter than any bullet. He has a son. That single sentence had cracked everything open. His uncle Edwin had left more than 7 widows and a ranch choking beneath old debts and blood feuds. He'd left, behind a child. Somewhere out there was a rightful heir to Cedar Ridge, and Jesse couldn't shake the weight of that revelation. If Boone got wind of it, the boy would be a pawn. If Red Hawk learned of it, the boy would be leverage. And if one of the widows knew where he was, he looked at them now, their faces tight with fear and secrets, and wondered which of them was, holding back the last piece of truth he needed. Boone's return came at dawn. The first rider was spotted on the ridge by Ada, who had kept silent watch through the night, her hunting knife glinting faintly in the gray light. By the time Jesse joined her, Boone's men were already cresting the horizon, more than 40 this time, maybe 50, a black tide spilling toward the ranch. Ada's voice was flat, steady as stone. This time he won't leave without blood. Inside, Jesse gathered the widows and Samuel Whitcomb, who had ridden from Dry Creek before dawn to warn them. Boone had bribed the sheriff and half the town to keep their hands clean, but there were still those willing to stand against him. Samuel had brought a handful of townsfolk with rifles and grim expressions, enough to make a difference but not enough to promise survival. "We hold them off as long as we can," Jesse said, his voice low but firm. "Boone can't afford a drawn-out fight. If we make this cost him more than he's willing to pay, he'll pull back." Ruby spat into the dirt and loaded her revolver. "Or he'll burn us all alive." As the sun rose, painting the soaked prairie in streaks of pale gold, Boone rode forward at the head of his men. He wore a black coat, rain-darkened and gleaming like oil, his hat low over a smile that never touched his eyes. "Carter," he called, his voice carrying clean across the field. "Last chance. Walk away, and you live. Stay, and I'll salt this land till nothing grows but bones." Jesse stepped past the porch rail, his revolver hanging loose at his side, but his stance steady. "This ranch don't belong to you," he said. Boone's smile widened. "And it sure as hell don't belong to you either. But it will." The silence after his words was heavier than the storm clouds gathering overhead. And then Boone raised his hand. Gunfire erupted. The battle for Cedar Ridge began in a roar of thunder and bullets. Jesse dove behind a wagon as splinters exploded around him. Ada's arrows whistled through the air, finding their marks with deadly precision. Ruby fired from the upper window, her revolver smoking as she shouted curses sharp enough to cut glass. Clara crouched low behind the porch rail, reloading Jesse's spare revolver with shaking hands, her face pale but her jaw set. Boone's men pressed hard, their numbers overwhelming, but the defenders of Cedar Ridge fought like people with nothing left to lose. The widows moved with surprising coordination, each knowing their role without a word spoken. Then Jesse saw Boone himself, riding hard for the southern flank, flanked by 2 riders carrying torches. It hit him what Boone intended before the first flame caught. Boone wasn't here to win the ranch. He was here to burn it to the ground. Jesse ran, firing until his revolver clicked empty, tackling one of the riders from his horse and sending them both into the mud. The torch rolled free, hissing as the rain snuffed it out. Jesse reached for his revolver, but Boone was already there, looming above him with his rifle raised. "Should have sold when I offered," Boone snarled. Before Jesse could react, a single shot cracked through the chaos. Boone jerked in the saddle, his eyes wide with shock, and toppled backward into the mud. Clara stood on the porch, her rifle still smoking. For a moment, the fight stuttered, as if time itself had paused to take in what had happened. Boone's men hesitated, looking to the ground where their leader lay sprawled and motionless. A few cursed and pressed on, but most pulled back, confusion breaking their lines. Jesse barely had time to catch his breath before Red Hawk rode into the fray with a band of Lakota warriors, their war cries cutting through the rain like knives. He wasn't here for Boone. He was here for Jesse. Red Hawk dismounted, his long braids heavy with water, his gaze burning beneath the shadow of his headdress. "Your uncle stole this land," he said, his voice carrying above the fading gunfire. "Now you steal his sins. Cedar Ridge was ours before it was ever yours." Jesse lowered his weapon slowly. "Then take it," he said, breath ragged. "Take the land. Take it all. I didn't come here to fight you. I came to survive what my uncle left behind." For a long, tense moment, Red Hawk studied him, the storm breaking overhead in sheets of cold rain. Finally, he spoke. "There is a boy," he said. "Your uncle's blood. He lives among us now." Jesse's chest tightened. "He's alive?" Red Hawk nodded once. "And he will inherit this land when he is grown. That is the only justice here." The fighting ended as suddenly as it began. Boone's men fled into the hills, leaderless and broken. Red Hawk and his warriors vanished back into the mist, taking the knowledge of the boy with them. Inside Cedar Ridge, silence returned. The widows sat together in the parlor, their dresses torn, their faces streaked with soot and tears. Eliza clutched her rosary so tightly the beads had left marks on her palms. Ruby stared into the fire, hollow-eyed. Ada stood by the window, watching the horizon for enemies who were already gone, and Clara sat beside Jesse, her hand brushing his in quiet solidarity. For the first time since he'd arrived, Jesse felt the weight of Cedar Ridge settle fully onto his shoulders. This ranch wasn't just his inheritance, and it was a graveyard of promises broken and debts unpaid. But maybe, just maybe, it could also be the place where something new began. When dawn finally broke clean and clear, Jesse stood on the porch, watching the sun rise over the battered land. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and ash, but beneath it lay the promise of grass, of water, of life still clinging stubbornly to the frontier. He knew now that Cedar Ridge didn't belong to him. Not fully. It belonged to the widows, to Red Hawk's people, and one day to a boy who carried the blood of Edwin Carter and all the weight of his choices. But until that day came, Jesse would stay. Because sometimes inheritance isn't about land or wealth. It's about redemption.